Nantucket Island for those of you who are dialing in from far away. And we're so excited and pleased to have Nat and Peter with us today. I'm just going to say a couple of words by way of introduction, and then we'll begin. So Nat Philbrick is the author of 11 books of history, including Mayflower, A Story of Courage, Community, and War. And Peter Panchy taught U.S. history on Nantucket for 28 years. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard and a master's degree from Lesley University. And I think it will be clear pretty quickly, but Peter and Nat are great friends. And so I think you're in for a very special conversation. And I encourage you as we go along, if you think of a question, please put it in the Q&A. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon. We won't be able to keep track of questions in the chat because there's just so many of you. So questions in the Q&A, and at the end of the presentation, we'll bring them up and go through them. So with that, I will bow out and take it away.
Okay, and I'd like to just start off by encouraging anyone who hasn't read Nat's book to read it. It's a tremendously important story and wonderfully told by Nat. And I'd like to begin taking a quote from the prologue, which is, instead of the story we already know, it becomes a story we need to know. And I'd like to start, Nat, by just saying, what brought you to that? What brought you to this, and why is it a story we need to know?
Yeah, well, I grew up, I think, like a lot of Americans, with the Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims, a story that was trotted out every November. I participated in how many elementary school pageants. And it was a story of a heroic story of American origins, but also seemed kind of stale, even when I was a little kid. You know, the Pilgrims had buckles on their shoes and funny hats. It just was one of those things that already seemed almost in mothballs. And my wife, Melissa, and I moved to Nantucket in 1986, and I became fascinated with the history of the island. And it was while researching my first work of history away offshore, which tells the history of Nantucket with each chapter focusing on a specific person. It was while researching that I realized I had to put Nantucket in its proper context of the history of New England. And it was then that I read William Bradford's, who was the longtime governor of Plymouth Plantation. I read William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. And it was a book I was aware of, but had never really studied seriously. And it blew all those stereotypical notions of the Pilgrims, of the first Thanksgiving, out the window. It is an incredible book. It's, for my money, by far the best work of American literature from the 18th century. It describes what happens in Plymouth Colony in terms of diplomacy with the native peoples, in terms of the turmoil within the settlement. It became apparent that these were real people, and just as messed up and terrified and confused as we are today. And so I realized, wow, I got to return to that story. And it was, the other thing that led me to this story was reading the town meeting records, which are at the town building. And we Nantucketers take our link to history for granted, I think. I mean, where else can you live in a community where within 1/8 of a mile is the Nantucket Historical Association, the town building, and the Nantucket Atheneum, the three institutions that have incredible documentary record. And it was while reading the town meeting, we have town meetings every week now. Well, they had them in 1665, and one of the town meeting records records that Philip, who is the son of Massasoit, the sachem of the Wampanoag people who formed an alliance with the Pilgrims, his son, Metacom, then known as Philip, he had been given an English name, attended a town meeting. And I realized, wow, the native side of this is so much more complicated than I realized. this is a story of two peoples that I was convinced was going to lead me in directions I never would have dreamt of when I was a fifth grader in Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh.
You know, it's one of the things you mentioned is how human the story becomes when you get beyond kind of the cookie cutter rendition, which actually began in the 20th century and greatly through grammar schools. And we could talk about the purposes of that kind of mythology as opposed to history and where the overlap is. But what struck me in what you just said was the humanity of what was going on. And in your book, you show that on both the Indian side and the Pilgrim side. And I think it's actually one of the quotes from Winslow early on in the first years, where he's kind of talking about the Indians like they're really human beings just like us, and they worry about this, and they and that's one of the great messages, if you don't mind expanding.
Well, it's kind of the takeaway I have had with history in all my books is that the real story is so much more interesting. And it was a completely different time. And so, drawing parallels to the current situation is fraught. And yet there is an essential humanity that history brings to life in a different time. And when it came to this, you're right, Edward Winslow, who would be Bradford's diplomatic leader, was the one who really developed a very close personal connection with Massasoit. And he in one of his letters back to the rest of the congregation that remained in Leiden, Holland, was that these are people just like ourselves, trusty, which was a version of what we would call trustworthy. And one of the things that I think turned Plymouth Colony, because the Pilgrims, those that came from Leiden, really wanted to create a religious community, focused completely on their connection to God. But what happened was it wasn't a blank slate when they arrived in America. There were other people living there. And it wasn't just another people. There was another people caught in a very tumultuous time. Just 3 years before the arrival of the Pilgrims, a series of epidemics that make our global pandemic look like nothing ran through the native populations along the eastern seaboard, killing in some instances 80% of the population. I mean, can you imagine? We are so freaked out by our pandemic, but can you imagine a society that weathers this kind of death? And when the Pilgrims arrived at what they called Plymouth, they were happy because it had been cleared by the previous occupants. But what they also found were the whitened bones of the dead. They had died so quickly they were unable to bury those who were dying. And so, this is a story that of people. And Massasoit had emerged from this great maelstrom of fear and death, and forged a very personal alliance with the leaders of Plymouth Colony. And so, for me, that's what is important about this story. Is that it is people. It is, it's not myths that we can, feel good about ourselves, because ultimately the story of the past doesn't make us feel any better, because it like any, this story we'll be talking about them, has this uplift, and but it also has some really sober things to teach us about what can go wrong. And so that's what excited me about telling this story, that it would lead me into unexpected territory, given the myths I had grown up with, but would ultimately be a very human story.
Well, that humanity, again, is shown the 100 years or so prior to the Pilgrims, whether it was fishermen or explorers, or really kind of rapacious raids on the eastern seaboard. We come across Squanto and Hobbamock, who were both captured and taken and developed the use of the English language, which was of great use to the Pilgrims in establishing their beachhead, so to speak. But it's also interesting to me that as we went from December to March when there really was an alliance forged, but in that time, many recordings of the Indians watching them. And I can't remember exactly where, Nat, but you allude to they were interested because these foreigners, these strangers to them, this group was different.
Yeah.
They had families.
Right.
They had children and women. They weren't just coming to either raid or get food. And that provoked an interest and a different kind of interest from the Indians.
Right. Well, you raise a couple of very good points. I think there's a tendency to think of the story of the arrival of the Pilgrims as, a first contact, of European meets native people. And that's just not true. Verrazano had come through Narragansett Bay more than 100 years earlier and had met, possibly Massasoit's great-great-grandfather. And since then, just as you alluded to, there were a series of explorers, a series of people that were trying to harvest sassafras that was used for treating syphilis and other kinds of diseases. And inevitably, those interactions would turn violent. And it happened over and over again. And just prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims, there had been an English vessel that had washed up somewhere in the vicinity of Plymouth, and what we call now the Wampanoags were, so angry with them that they took several as those that they did not execute. They took as prisoners, and so there was all sorts of stuff going on, and as you also alluded to, several Wampanoag had been taken to England, where they were shown as a wonder on the streets of London. I mean, can you imagine? This is to Squanto, who the Pilgrims referred to as Squanto, knew English, knew London. In fact, had been to London more recently than the Pilgrims had, who had spent the last 10 years in Holland. And so he was someone, and what you find is with interpreters, they, someone who knows both languages between two different groups, the interpreter has a very key role because only that person knows what both sides are saying and is in a position to change the message if it suits his or her ends. And what Bradford becomes to realize, as they all do, is that Squanto is playing his own game, as he says, that Squanto had grown up in Patuxent, what the native peoples called Plymouth. This was his native home. And he had left before all the epidemics had hit. So can you imagine this? He arrives to his hometown, as the English explorer that accompanied him described it, as void. It was gone. He is taken prisoner by Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag. Massasoit doesn't trust him, but it would become clear that Squanto had his own ambitions. Massasoit's people had been devastated by these diseases, and the rival tribe, the Narragansett, on the other side of Narragansett Bay, had hardly been touched by the disease. And so they were in a position to take over the Wampanoag. And Massasoit began to view the Pilgrims as a possible ally. And it wasn't the strength of their community. It was, within 3 months, they had lost half their people. I mean, just devastation. But what they had were weapons. And according to Squanto, they also had hidden in their cellar the plague that they could unleash at will. A weapon of mass destruction of its time.
Yeah.
and so, that changes things. And so what the Pilgrims are in the middle of a very complicated diplomatic situation, much more complicated than they're even aware of. And what is fascinating to me about the story is the Pilgrims do an amazing job of diplomacy, but it's the native side where, they're it's an even more sophisticated game of playing one group against the other.
Yeah. Well, as you point out very dramatically, most of the tribes are against Massasoit in allying with these strangers.
Yeah.
And so he takes a tremendous risk that's not popular with the surrounding tribes. One of the, I think, great stresses on the importance of Squanto to Bradford is later on the importance of that interpreter, even after it's relatively clearly proven that Squanto had a plot to wipe out Plymouth, that Bradford would not execute him, would not try him, would not give up this valued interpreter. It seems a bit odd to me that Squanto, in the the kind of mythical version, is the Pilgrim's great friend, and we never hear of Hobbamock, who's so much more loyal and helps out in different ways. I mean, Squanto did help them plant their first corn crops and teach them to eel and fish, but Hobbamock is a straight dealer. He is not scheming the way Squanto did, and it just struck me as kind of just the oddities of humans, the way Squanto's role becomes so pure and helpful, the noble savage kind
Once
of
again,
thing.
the workings of myth. But for Bradford, I mean, he came to be very loyal to Squanto because he realized they would have the English would have perished that first winter if Massasoit had not formed this alliance. I mean, it saved them all. And when Squanto taught them how to use the plant the native corn, the beans, all of this, it saved their lives. And with that, that forged a real bond between the two of them. And as you said, it becomes clear that Squanto is playing his own game. Massasoit demands that Bradford turn him over so Massasoit can execute the miscreant, and Bradford won't let him go. And this imperils the relationship with Massasoit. They work their way through it. But this is a nervy game of brinksmanship on all sides. It's an amazing story. And this is where myth does a real disservice to history. It blunts the edges. It makes us, it feeds the impulse to look at the past as a simpler time. When people knew what they were doing, and that's the, history, we have hindsight, we can see where it's going, and we have this tendency to connect the dots and think that those people in the past could see where it was going. No, not at all. They had no clue. They were making it up as they went along. It was, and in doing that, what I'm trying to do when I write a book like Mayflower, I'm trying to create a sense of what it's like then, that indeterminacy, the sense that we are on the edge of everything going haywire. How can we keep moving? And so, so once again, it's the humanity, but it's also the complexity. As you alluded to earlier, the native side, it was not one monolithic English versus native. There were the term Wampanoag was formed after the fact. The village, it was really the villages throughout the Cape and islands and on the what's now Plymouth, and these were like the city states of Italy that each one had its own independence, and yet there were alliances, but they could change very quickly. So extremely fluid. extremely dynamic. And that's where I had great respect ultimately for both Massasoit and Bradford. They were, no one at that time knew what the long-term consequences would be, but in the terms of their own lifetimes, they did commendable jobs of leadership, of communicating with the other side, and making every effort they could to keep peace maintained.
And also, you had mentioned earlier too, Winslow plays an incredibly important diplomatic role. And one of the really outstanding things is when Massasoit is dying of what's probably typhus off the Dutch ship that had come by. And Winslow is able to heal him and several other members of that settlement, which, if I've got my chronology correct, it almost is an antidote to Bradford's resistance to trying or turning over Squanto.
Changes
so in
everything.
a way, Winslow kind of salvages this fragile alliance that's going on.
As you said, Massasoit, this is after they forged this alliance. The relations between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag have hit, are at a nadir. It's looking really tense, really bad. And then Massasoit gets desperately sick. And Bradford determines we need to find out what's happening with him. So he sends Winslow out with a few others. And Winslow discovers Massasoit dying in his quarters. And then, this is hands-on diplomacy. He goes in there, he makes up potions to help him, and miraculously, Massasoit comes back. And, he says, "You've saved my life. Let me tell you, there is an attack planned by the Massachusetts to your left, to the north. And you should hit them hard before they hit you." And Winslow comes back, and sure enough, the Pilgrim leaders talk, and Bradford sends none other than Miles Standish, the military officer, on a raid to attack Wessagusset, which was just south of Boston, but to the north of Plymouth. And there it's an unprovoked attack in which it's basically a commando hit. In
some ways it's subterfuge. He invites them in to lunch in a way, and then executes and captures.
It's brutal.
It is. It's vicious.
It's vicious, and he kills one of their top warriors, chops off his head, and it's brought back to Plymouth wrapped in a piece of white linen, and the head is planted on a fence post, and that piece of white linen is raised on the flagpole, this bloody piece of linen. And at about this time, Bradford, whose first wife had died soon after their arrival in America, he remarries and has the wedding ceremony, and Massasoit and his warriors attend. And that is when the flag is raised, and that is when the alliance is forged, an alliance that will last for 50 years. But you could also say it was alliance forged in blood. And so this is not the story we were taught in elementary school.
Well, the true picture of Miles Standish that comes across. I mean, he's mentioned more in the mythological version as kind of a foil for John Alden and Priscilla, but he's a terrifying person in lots of ways. I mean, he's the ultimate warrior. He is there to defend the colony, and he will shed blood mercilessly to achieve that end.
Right. I think we might, in our we might say that he had an anger management issue.
Yeah.
Because what's really interesting, it's not just the Wessagusset, the brutality of that encounter, that character, that is evidence that Miles Standish was kind of a hothead. There's all sorts of other encounters he would have with Englishmen, whether they were cod fishermen or people from other communities that began to spring up around, and he would just go berserk, and this is one of, and you see Bradford's leadership. He understands who's the personality. He's got a Miles Standish. He also has a Winslow, who is a born diplomat, will actually leave Plymouth Colony to be one of Cromwell, the great Puritan leader who will, win the English Revolution, and he will go off and work for him. But there's really some talent here in this little tiny community, undergoing enormous stresses, and so what is amazing to me is with those first turbulent couple of years, it would forge an alliance that would last for 50 years in Plymouth Colony between two very different peoples. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't perfect by any means, but both sides worked at it to keep each other informed, and it would last, and then it would all be blown away with the one of the most violent, deadly wars in American history between Massasoit's son Metacom, also known as Philip, and the English, and that is, for me, the real lesson of this story, is that it is possible for alliances to be forged, but they can so easily be blown apart.
Yeah, and before we move to that, because that is the great ultimate impact of your book, I just wanted to, for the participants, stress that the success of Plymouth breeds the English to start some other colonies along the Massachusetts coast, most notably in 1630, the 1,000 or so settlers who found Massachusetts Bay.
Right. The
Puritans, for sure. And then also, you and I had talked a little bit about the changes in trade and how that kind of sabotaged the alliance as well. If you'd care to talk about that, the movement from furs.
Yeah, well, and as far both of those factors are huge when it comes to what will ultimately happen. Plymouth is established. It's a very modest settlement, and which is in keeping with Bradford's image of recreating the congregation that they had once had in Leiden. But inevitably, with the Pilgrims proved to have very large families. One of them, John Howland, who on the Mayflower falls over the side of the Mayflower in a storm. It should have been in the end of him, but he grabs a halyard that's streaming into the water, pulls himself up, survives, and he ultimately has more than 80 grandchildren. And Plymouth was very limited in terms of the land. It's not all of Massachusetts by any means. It's where Plymouth is now and Cape Cod. They didn't have a vast area to move into. And so as children were born and grandchildren, they wanted land. And it was beginning to fill up. On the native side, the first years of this alliance are very profitable for them because they have furs to sell to the English. And so the Wampanoag ride this influx of all sorts of income and buy English goods and integrate them into their own culture. And then in 1630, we have the arrival of the Puritans. The Puritans were very similar to the Pilgrims in religious belief, but they were from a different part of England, from the East Anglia, from the eastern side. They tended to be better educated and more well off, and they came in huge numbers, thousands upon thousands of them. It's known as the Great Migration. They were their version of William Bradford was John Winthrop. They established their colony in Boston. They had Massachusetts, which then included Maine, but they Winthrop's son would create another colony to the south called Connecticut. And so, vast amount of land compared to Plymouth colony. Suddenly, Plymouth, the originator of English settlements in the region, becomes, this poor, elderly aunt to what's happening in the rest of New England. And so you have, and with this influx, you have the furs being hunted out. And so the Native Americans don't have, the source of an income, something to trade with the English. The only thing they have that the English value is their land. And so, particularly in Plymouth colony, where there is no hinterland for the young to go or the native peoples to move to, both peoples are living very cheek by jowl. They're right on top of each other. The Winthrop, in his wisdom, it's determined that the Wampanoag, remember, this is the Wampanoag land. The English, but Winthrop realizes, Bradford realizes that we've got to make sure that there's a good-sized Native American piece of land that is theirs, and which was what we now call Bristol, Rhode Island, Warren, Rhode Island, and so that was there. That became the Wampanoag Center. But it's the tensions are rising, and in the second generation, the young English say, why do we need these Indians? What good are they? They're in the way of my prosperity. And then on the native side, the young warriors are saying, what good are the English? They're going to wipe us out. We need to do something. And so, it becomes very difficult for the leadership on both sides as tensions escalate.
Before we jump to that great change to King Philip's War, I think in fairness to folks, they want to hear about Thanksgiving.
Absolutely.
And that first Thanksgiving. And of course, both in England, they had previous harvest festivals. Native Americans are really renowned for their close living with nature and their appreciation and thankfulness for what the world has provided them. And they thank their creators on both sides. But how we got to the first Thanksgiving, do you want to address the real story of the so-called first Thanksgiving, and then we could talk about how it evolved in the United States?
Right. Well, first of all, the Pilgrims never called it a Thanksgiving. It was, as you alluded to, a harvest festival, which any village in England had. Once it would have probably been in late September or October, once the crops were in, and and this was a very historic time for this group of English settlers. They had no reason to be alive. But because of Massasoit forging that alliance, they had grown crops and they had a relative bounty. And so they decided that they were going to celebrate. And so William Bradford instructs, I think it's three of their men to go out and hunt for fowl, so that they can have something to eat while they celebrate. And by this time, it looks like they had brewed their first beer, which was very important to the Pilgrims, who really distrusted water, because water back in Europe tended to be, full of disease. And so you wanted to have beer was much healthier alternative. So they have beer, they have fowl, and the Wampanoag hear, what's something going on in Plymouth colony, and And then Massasoit and 100 warriors and their and kids and their wives and show up with freshly killed deer, and quickly the Pilgrim Harvest Festival becomes a primarily Wampanoag event. The English are outnumbered 2-1. Most of the food is provided by the native peoples, and this is really remarkable that this is happening. That they are hanging out together, they're celebrating together. And so there is a real underlying element of truth to, our mythic sense of a Thanksgiving meal. I mean, it's a pretty darn remarkable historic occasion. But, it was not, those Victorian tableaus or, you could see them in a Currier Ives print of the pious pilgrims seated around a long table with a white tablecloth and this big turkey and pumpkin pie and all that, that with as a few curious Native Americans look on. And no, that never happened. And this became an official holiday during the Civil War under Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And this was at a time when the country was falling apart, literally being torn apart. And so it was deemed important to create a myth of origins, a myth of Thanksgiving. The Pilgrim unity, exactly, unity. And so thus was forged the legend of that first Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims had plenty of Thanksgivings, but this was not technically one of them. And so, so it went on from there. But it's, I think it's up to everyone to celebrate it in the way they want to. I personally, it's a great holiday for me because it's always on Thursday, and you also get Friday off. But
it's interesting. We also owe a debt of gratitude to a woman, which is not unusual. But Presidents Washington and Adams actually had Thanksgiving proclamations. I have to check her name. Sarah Joseph Hale, who was the editor of Godey's Ladies Book, went on in the 1920s, started a campaign to make Thanksgiving a national holiday, because after Adams, I guess it had fallen away from this appreciation. And Lincoln was the first president who ever answered her letters. And he shoots, much like his second inaugural, it's not just unity, it's we have to care for all the harm this war is doing to us. And that's
that's where legends, I think, myths, there is a power in them. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, it's a shorthand for history that does not do history justice, obviously. Right. But they're at a time like the Civil War, these things have a power and a restorative, an ability to at least create the illusion that there better times were in the past and potentially better times are in the future. And so, the other side of it, though, is, for the native peoples, there was this moment, but, it was not going to last. And I think that's very important for all Americans to keep in mind, that keep the wider context of what would unfold.
And often myths try to teach us not only who we are, but the ideal image of who we want to be. And this does get picked up in our schools in the 20th century. And it's an important function. It's a positive function. History and myth have an overlap, that myths aren't just made out of whole cloth. They do revolve around events. We, of course, prefer the the truth. Again, the humanity of all these stories. I'm thinking back to Miles Standish for a minute again, in that, oh, I can't remember. Watagummet is the man he kills.
Yes.
He's taken aback by how he insults his height the day before. Yeah. You know, you're not much of a man, you're so short. And then I forget, I think it's Hobbamock who says, yeah, he put you down as short, but you showed him. And it's such a petty thing, but that's a part of who we are as humans too.
Exactly. You know, and that it's you know, there is the inspirational side, but there, you know, human behavior, it's pretty consistent. It doesn't change. I mean, beliefs do, economic circumstances, you know, all technology change, all of this changes. But you know, one of the things I won't say I've learned, because I don't know if I've learned anything in studying history except to be humility. You know, the saying that, you know,
Absolutely.
if you know, if you don't know your history, those who do not know their history will are doomed to repeat it. Well, you can know your history really well, but you're still going to be doomed to repeat it, because when you're living life, you don't have the benefits of hindsight. You're in the middle of it, and 200 years from now, people are going to look at us here in 2020, and they're going to say, "What were they thinking?" Because, you know, what is consuming us, what seems so important to us, we are inevitably missing what is really going to be important in the future.
I'm going to use that as a segue to allow you to talk a little bit about King Philip's War. But again, a quote, I think it's from your epilogue, and I think you attribute it again to, I don't know if it's Bradford or Winslow, Nat, but it's that we gave up on the difficult work of living with our neighbors, and you know, how compromise and accommodation is rejected. Yeah. And to me, that really speaks to us right now if we look at our political situation, where
Absolutely.
we turned into enemies rather than neighbors who are working toward a common good.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's, you know, it's become so polarized now, and I think both sides are at fault. I mean, at some point, we have to say, look, you know, we don't agree, but we can talk about this civilly.
And there is a common good.
Right, because there has to be a sense of common good. And it's up to both sides to do that. And I mean, you know, that's where the lesson of King Philip's War, I think, really speaks to it. Bradford and Massasoit, they did not agree. They had all this, but they realized they needed each other. And, you know, you can be idealistic and want change and all that. But the fact is, if you are going to create effective, long-lasting change, you have to compromise. That's the only way. No one knows exactly the right thing to go. It's, you know, and that's what's so maddening about our political system. You know, there's two sides, and the two sides battle it out. And it's only through compromise that something positive can be created for the future. And, you know, for 50 years in Plymouth Colony, that kind of attitude prevailed. But then with a change of leadership and the deterioration on both sides of the living situation, people decide, no, you know, it's the heck with this, you know, and they go to war. And it proved to be a war that, you know, the English, you know, there was people in the English who said, let's go to war because it'll be good for us. It was not good for the English. It would, you know, be 14 months of the most brutal fighting ever in America. A third of the English towns in New England would be burned and abandoned. There were more casualties than the Civil War by far. For the native peoples, it was even worse. And the per capita income in New England among the English would not be the same for another 100 years. They were put into such severe debt by this. So this war destroyed on both sides the community that had been formed 55 years before. And I think there is a lesson here today. It's so polarized now, and people have gotten to the point where they cannot be in the same room with someone who does not have their political beliefs. And if we can persist at this, nothing is going to happen. Nothing positive.
It brings me back to Lincoln with his, we cannot separate, we are not enemies. We're bound by these mystic cords of memory, of what we've previously done together. And maybe on that note, Nat, we should allow the patient listeners to get a chance to ask some questions. Amy, are you there? Do you want to switch it?
Sure. And Janet, my partner in crime, is joining us as well. So we do have some questions. Let's see. I should start at the top here.
Well, Amy's doing that. Nat, thanks so much. I put a lot of pressure on you to explain a lot of things. And
no, Peter,
talk about it. It was grand.
Well, and for the audience, Peter Panchy has one of the greatest knowledges of American history of anyone I know, and he is a real resource for this island. So, thank you, Peter.
Likewise, thank you very much, Nat. It's a pleasure to know you and to read all your books.
All right, so we actually have a couple of questions for Nat that people are curious about your methods in researching the book. If you talk to people or how did you go about researching it? So one here from Allison says, who was the most direct relative to the Mayflower or history that you were able to interview for your research?
Yeah. Well, one of the great challenges of writing this book was the lack of written information from a Native perspective. And when it came to the Native side of this story, after writing Away Offshore, I researched and wrote a book called Abram's Eyes. And that's really the book that led me to write Mayflower. And I spent 4 years researching that book, investigating oral traditions, talking to Wampanoags on the Cape and Martha's Vineyard. Richard Gardner, who was the Wampanoag tribal historian, was a huge help to me. We went on a road trip where he took me to various places that were, whether it was the Pilgrim side, but mainly the King Philip's War side. And so oral traditions are tricky. They as from a historian, you're looking for information that was recorded as close to the event as possible before too much time has passed, and the story changes. Oral traditions evolve over time, whether they're Native, whether they're English, and there are plenty of oral traditions related to on the English side as well. And it became clear to me, none of them were of the kind, particularly on the English side, that were going to get in they really didn't help me when it came to the actual events of what were unfolding back then. And so I made a decision with this book that I was going to hew to the historic record, and when it came to the Native side, there were a lot of Native evidence that came from written sides, whether it was Roger Williams and Rhode Island and all that. But I talked to people on both sides, but it was the historic record that I was using, and and it's been great ever since Mayflower came out. I've just been talking to descendants, and everyone has a story to tell, and they're interesting, and but I stand by what I wrote in Mayflower.
Okay, I have a question from David. I'm going to scale it down a little bit. After the first winter, many of the colonists died, and it was largely adults. Left behind were children who lost one or both parents. And how did this generation of children differ from their parents? their parents had the goal of establishing a religious colony. Did this next generation move away from that goal? And how do we understand this colony of children?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I don't know if I can answer it in any effective way. But just imagine though, this group of kids, talk about a traumatic childhood. It kind of is the prototype for that. And yes, the whole family units were destroyed. But I think it also created this community was based. Half the people died. And out of that, Edward Winslow is a perfect example. His wife died. He ends up marrying a widow within weeks of the deaths of both of their spouses. Because what else? They both had children on both sides. They forged new families. And this is kind of what happened throughout Plymouth Colony. And so I think when it came to that initial group, it forged bonds that were extraordinarily deep. And I think that would contribute to the steadiness of the colony in those first decades. But it's hard to track what the specific individual was like. And just one word for, yes, Peter.
No, I was also going to interject. We never touched on the fact that there were some supplemental arrivals from the Fortune and others that brought additional, I think it's 37 and then 60 people to the colony. But initially, that is a increased stressor rather than a help, because they've been marshaling their small supplies of food. And as these people come, they get pushed back into reducing their sustenance diet.
Absolutely. No. And so what you do and what you realize, because of just do the numbers, within 4 years, there were more people in the colony that hadn't been there for that first year than there were. So it was shifting very quickly. The one thing I do want to say, sort of in closing with this question, is that is to turn the spotlight to William Bradford, because Bradford had looked to this colony as a way to recreate the incredible spiritual bond they had had in Leiden, Holland, under their minister, John Robinson. And this was the whole point of this voyage, was to recreate that. They had spent 10 years in Holland. The spiritual bond was wonderful, but their kids were becoming Dutch, and they were proudly English. But it was illegal for them to move back to England because they did not agree to worship with the Church of England. And that's why they had gone to Holland. And so they come here with the idea of creating that spiritual bond, reconnecting with their English roots. They reconnect with their English roots, but the spiritual bond does not come to be. John Robinson dies before he can make his way to America. The next generation starts moving from Plymouth. They want land, so they move to the Cape and outlaw Marshfield and areas outside. And William Bradford, when he dies, he is not proud and happy about what has happened in Plymouth Colony. He's sad. The promise that they had that had never come to be. They had never become what he had hoped Plymouth would be. And he compares Plymouth to an abandoned mother, that all her children have left. A situation only amplified by the arrival of all the Puritans in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And so I find it really poignant that Bradford, who sees the colony through so much, is ultimately feels that it's evolved in ways that are disillusioning and are ultimately unfaithful to the original mission of the Pilgrims.
Okay. We have a question from Penny about the Mayflower Compact. And I was just reading an article yesterday where the author said the Mayflower Compact, was one of the underpinnings of our American democracy. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, the Mayflower Compact, it's interesting. There's a group of scholars that dismiss it as saying it had nothing to do with anything that happened after it. And then there are people who look to it, as a fundamental American document. I think it is a fundamental American document. It is not the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution in utero, but it is an extraordinary document. It's, for one thing, it's wonderfully written. There's real evidence that it pays a huge debt to John Robinson, the minister who never made it over, who realized that since half the passengers on the Mayflower were Leideners from Holland, and half were what the Leideners called strangers, were English people who did not share their beliefs. He realized that at some point they were going to have to forge, have a document in which they agreed to all serve under their civil leaders, not their religious leaders, which is significant. And so this document, what spurred it was that their original intention was not to create a settlement in New England, but to create a settlement on the Hudson River. They could have been Yankee fans. Imagine that. But they made first landfall in the Cape, and they tried to sail south, almost wrecked the ship on Pollock Rip, which is still a terrifying piece of shoal water to this day. And the captain, Master Jones, said, I'm getting these guys off my boat as quickly as possible. He pulls into what's now Provincetown Harbor, and this situation created bedlam among the passengers because they didn't have legal right to create a settlement in this part of the world. And the strangers say, wait a minute, by this point, I think they've spent 10 weeks with this group of religious nuts that they began and said, whoa, I don't know if we want to hitch our star to this group. And some of the strangers say, once we get to land, all bets are off. We're going our own way. Now, this would have been a disaster. It would have meant the end of the settlement even before they begin to start. And they could have looked to Miles Standish, put down the rebels and make them toe the line. Instead, they create the Mayflower Compact, in which everyone agreed to abide by their chosen civil leaders. And it was no different from the form of government they knew in England, but it was a document written 3,000 miles away on the other side of the Atlantic. And that makes it, for my money, a fundamental American document.
And again, stressing what we brought up a couple times before, in creating this body politic, which was their phrase, again, they're trying to establish a unity.
Yep.
That we have to share something, we all have to adhere, or we blow apart. And Stephen Hopkins, I think it is my wife's distant relative. I mean, he was a known mutineer and a bit of a wild man, and he was one of the very ones who was a stranger who was like, yeah, once we're on shore, we'll do whatever we want. And to create this notion of working together is part of our great heritage. So I also see this as a tremendous founding document for Americans.
Absolutely. And just as a footnote, Stephen Hopkins, this was not his first time to the New World. He had been at Jamestown, and on the way they wrecked in Bermuda, and where he led a mutiny very similar to what could have happened in Plymouth. And the story of this wreck would inspire Shakespeare's The Tempest. And so, once again, this story is just so important. It's in a vortex of historical situations that are really fundamental.
Yeah.
Yep. So a couple of people had questioned about the myth of Thanksgiving. Your account of the first Thanksgiving seems to contain much of the spirit of Thanksgiving and the Thanksgiving story. Yet you say was not, sorry, I'm left wondering what was missing from the myth besides the tablecloth, and what is it that was not primarily a Christian religious event that is effectively the mythical part.
Yeah, well, it was. They describe it as a harvest festival. I mean, that isn't. I'm paraphrasing there, but they say, they do not say, we then gave thanks or whatever, which would have been a Thanksgiving, which they would do all the time. And yet, on the other side, anything the Pilgrims did had huge religious that's where they came from. That was they spent every Sunday doing nothing but praying to their Lord. This was a central part of who they were. And yet, this was clearly, this was not a religiously inspired gathering. This was, I don't say it was to blow off a little steam, but it was, they had been through a terrifying ordeal over the last year. And this was a way to say, hey, we've made it. We have more bounty here, as Winslow described it. And all we know about what we call the first Thanksgiving is from a paragraph in Edward Winslow's letter. I mean, there's not a lot to go on. And so we're, the intensity of our gaze upon, this event, given the evidence, is kind of extraordinary. And so, I once again, it's today when we celebrate our first Thanksgiving, I think it's up to everyone to do it in the way they see fit, because it was a celebration, but there was also, given who they were, an extremely religiously oriented gathering as well.
If I could add a thought, I think in the myth as I heard it growing up was kind of that the Pilgrims invited the Native Americans in and, kind of fed them. I mean, if we look at the menu, it's a Native American menu, but that sense, I think it diminishes Thanksgiving in the sense, this was humans coming together in appreciation of life and survival. And there was an equality to it that I think the myth doesn't emphasize enough. I think one purpose of the myth is to make us as Americans feel good about ourselves. And I think in doing that, it doesn't give full recognition to the Native American. And as I said, just the coming together of humans to say, it's been a tough year, we've survived, we've helped each other, we have a good harvest, let's celebrate it.
Yeah, and just, as a footnote for today, here 2020, I mean, this has been one heck of a year for everybody. And, I don't know if anyone is in a mood to celebrate bounty, but it's for me, it's a time where, we've made it at least this far, and hopefully, better days are ahead.
Yeah, celebrate survival.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about historical dates, the difference between a Julian calendar and a Gregorian calendar.
This one's all yours, man.
Well, Peter, this is yours, man.
One person speculates that quite possibly the actual 400th anniversary is today and not on Thursday. So I don't know if you have any thoughts. You could shed some light on that.
No, not really. I mean, it's dating it could drive you insane trying to figure out how that all works. But yeah, I mean, if that's what you're going for, go for it. Celebrate it. I'd celebrate every day. I guess it's good. But yeah, I don't know. It's we know it happened about 400 years ago.
And wouldn't it be great if every day were a day of Thanksgiving?
Yes.
We have a couple questions about King Philip's War and how could the casualties be greater than the Civil War? I thought the populations were much smaller to begin with.
proportionally. It's the number of people who died per cap, percentage killed, and and that's how it felt. This was, when I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was, given the size of the English community, it was at least twice the casualty rate of the Civil War. And on the native side, it's unimaginable. There were, and this is, I think one of the things we haven't talked about yet, but we should, is, one of the terrible aspects of King Philip's War was, as the English captured native warriors, they were either used to help them capture more native warriors, but they were also enslaved. Josiah Winslow, who was the son of Edward Winslow, the great diplomat, Josiah Winslow had a totally different attitude towards the native peoples. And it was the council in Plymouth made the decision that these were rebels, and that rebels deserved to be enslaved for life. And so more than 1,000 Wampanoag were captured and sent in slave ships to what they called the West Indies, to the Caribbean, to the sugar plantations down there. And so, this is a year where we're all very aware of, the importance of slavery to our national story. And the fact is, there is the voyage of the Mayflower, but there's also the voyage of the Seaflower, a slave ship that departed from Boston with more than 100 Wampanoag slaves that were, made their way to the West Indies. And so, this is a story that's very relevant to the moment we are in today, whether it's, you're talking pandemic, whether you're talking the legacy of slavery. This is, it's not just a myth to make ourselves feel better. It's a story that relates to where we are today.
I guess it's my turn.
Well, while you're looking, Amy, I'm so glad that aspect of it came out as well, because again, it is another part of our heritage that we have to be very cognizant of.
Yeah.
We also didn't talk about the Pequot War and the, that was kind of the parallel to Miles Standish.
Yep, on a New England level, yeah, that involved the Puritans. And, this was going on all around. It was very turbulent, it never settled down. Yes, Amy?
So here's a very nuts and bolts kind of question from Marcia. Wants to know how the two sides communicated in terms of language barriers.
Yeah, well, they're very good question. We've talked a bit about Squanto as in his role as translator. But what became clear is that these two groups over that 50-year period were living in some cases almost side by side. It was very tight. There was no frontier the way we think of American history as it marched west. This was very what's now Swansea was right next to where Massasoit and then Metacom were based. And so there was a lot of communication where translators were important. There was Squanto, and then once it came to Metacom Phillips' time, there was a Sassaman who was a missionary. Because what happened, there was a guy named John Eliot, one of the Puritans, who took it upon himself to spread Christianity to the native peoples. And as part of that program, they did everything they could to turn a native person into an English person, hairstyle, to teaching language. There were even native peoples who went to Harvard, and one of them was named Sassaman, and he would be kind of the Squanto of 50 years later, and very similar to Squanto, Philip would begin to realize that as a interpreter, he was doing things that were not in Philip's best interest, and it would be his death. He seems to have been murdered, that would spark the tensions that ultimately led to the outbreak of King Philip's War. And so, communication was ongoing, and what you begin to learn is how closely, particularly the peoples who lived on the borderline, so to speak, were in terms of they would hire each other on both sides, actually, to help in the fields. And it was a very different time that it's kind of hard to imagine, given what would be the future of America.
If I could interject again, John Eliot's praying towns were really some of the first attempts to anglicize the Indians and really set that precedent of not respecting their culture. If they were going to continue, they had to become English.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
Christian.
Yep.
Okay. Can you tell us more about the first encounter beach in Northeastham?
Yes. Well, just sort of a side note, I urge all of you, if you're in this area, particularly if you're Nantucketers, and you're looking for a Cape Cod vacation, take your car over on the ferry, drive to Provincetown, and follow the route described. There were three Pilgrim exploratory voyages and journeys as they were trying to figure out where to settle. And so they made their way to what's now Truro. There's Cornhill is still there. That's where the Pilgrims would steal some corn. And then they'd make their way on the third voyage, and this would be the one that finally where they found Plymouth Harbor, but they spend the night near the Herring River, which it's on the north side of the Cape, and they spent the night, and in that morning they would be attacked by a group of native warriors, and that would be the first encounter. And first encounter beach, you can Google it on your maps app and find it, and you can go there and look out, and it's and the other thing is where the first place where they had water, they found the Pilgrim Spring is still something you can find along the way. And for me, Melissa and I drove all over the Cape following this route, and Melissa had grown up in Falmouth, and that's where we had met. And we knew the Cape pretty well, but this gave us a whole different appreciation for that, that geography as you follow their way towards what would become Plymouth.
Okay, well, now I have a new item for my bucket list. So it's 3:18 and we're just about out of time. So there are a number of people that want to know what you're working on now and what your future projects will look like. That seems like an excellent place to end it.
Sure. Well, I'm excited because I've just turned over my manuscript for my next book to the copy editor, and it's Peter knows all about it because he's read it in the manuscript. But I've written 3 books about the American Revolution, and I had very unexpectedly become fascinated with George Washington. I really didn't see it coming, and after finishing my last book, In the Hurricane's Eye, about Yorktown, I realized I'd had enough of bloodshed, no more wars, but I wanted to find out what happened to Washington. Well, when Washington became president, and we're getting back to the theme of unity here, he realized he was the leader of an already divided nation. They were 13 independent colonies that really had former colonies that really had no sense of nationhood. And he had to do something to instill a sense of solidarity, of a nation, of unity. And so he resolved to go on a series of road trips. To help achieve that. He would go as far north as Portsmouth, New Hampshire during his New England tour, during his Southern tour, which took him 3 months. And he did not travel by Air Force One. He traveled by a carriage pulled by 4 horses. And in his Southern tour, he went as far south as Savannah, Georgia. He was away for 3 months, traveled almost 2,000 miles. And I said, I want to, I don't want to do another straight history book. What to do? Well, Melissa, my wife, and our dog Dora and I have spent the last 2 years following George Washington's presidential travels. And the book that will be the result is inspired partly by my favorite travel book of all time, John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, in which he and his standard poodle Charlie head out to discover the meaning of America. With this, we headed out to discover the legacy of George Washington. So I think it's appropriately called Travels with George in Search of Washington and His Legacy. And it's a braided narrative with what happens to Melissa, myself, and Dora, and what happened to George in the 18th century. And it will be coming out in September of 2021.
And yes, I have read it. It's great. And again, it emphasizes no matter how different we all are, if our country is to survive and succeed, we need unity and a common area.
And that was Washington's whole point of this trip. It was a trip dedicated to creating unity. And, we took this during a time of increasing political divisions. And what struck us were not the divisions, but how much people had in common. And so that's what the book is about.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I look forward to reading it, and maybe you two would come back a year from now to tell us about it.
I think that might be arranged.
That'd be fun.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know there's a Patriots game on, and you probably want to know the score.
We'll catch the last quarter.
Okay, good.
So thank you so much for joining us. And that's kind of it.
Yep, that's our show.
Yep. Have a great afternoon.
So long.
Bye-bye.